Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the third of our regular Refugee Studies Centre public seminars for this Michaelmas Term 2020. Thanks for tearing yourself away from the riveting presidential race in the United States, no doubt filling yourself with caffeine to get us through this evening, and welcome. Tonight, I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Greg Beckett, our speaker, who's joining us from Western University in Ontario. Greg is a cultural anthropologist who trained at the University of Chicago and whose work looks at the lived experience of crisis, disaster, and trauma with a particular regional focus on the Caribbean. He's the author of the fascinating ethnography There Is No More Haiti, Between Life and Death in Port-au-Prince. And this book is one of the core texts for our master's course in refugee and forced migration studies. And it illuminates with great nuance and sensitivity how it feels to live and experience social crisis, economic collapse, political upheaval, many of the driving forces of forced migration. And tonight is going to delve into some of these themes to unpack for us the notion of the unlivable in Haiti, connecting structural crises with everyday experiences of disaster, and to talk about something which I imagine is on the minds of many of us this evening. So as always, please write your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Greg will speak for about 30 minutes, and then at 5:30, I will field these questions and pose them to Greg at the end. It's great to see you, Greg. Thanks very much, and I will pass over the floor to you.
Thank you so much. I just want to begin by thanking Professor Scott Smith and everyone at the Refugee Studies Center for inviting me, for having me here in this virtual space of Zoom. And thank you to all of you for being here and listening. Again, as Tom said, when there is, of course, a lot of uncertainty in the news cycle that we might want to doom school through. So my talk today is on this Haitian category of the unlivable, and trying to make sense of it ethnographically and theoretically as well, connecting it to a couple other concepts that I'll talk about in my talk today that I'm calling ordinary disaster and the atmosphere of crisis. And I want to begin, as anthropologists like to do, with a little vignette, a little story to bring us into the central problem of my talk. In the fall of 2019, my friend Paul wrote to me from Port-au-Prince to tell me about the difficult situation in Haiti, a situation that he characterized as an escalating political, economic, and humanitarian crisis. It was hard to specify what he meant by crisis, and we both noted how the word seemed necessary and yet at the same time incomplete or inadequate. The situation at that time, early 2019, involved daily protests against the government, staggering rates of inflation, and a political deadlock within the government, as well as a concerted effort by opposition groups to use a series of general strikes and roadblocks to shut the country down. That situation seemed to Paul and to many others in early 2019 to be unbounded in its effects. And I just, so people in Haiti were calling this at the time pays lock in Creole, which can be translated to blocked country, or to put it in a term that we're now all intimately familiar with, a kind of lockdown. And for most of 2019, most of Haiti was actually just shut down almost completely for very different reasons than we've seen lockdowns happen in 2020. Nothing was happening when Paul and I spoke. There was little or no electricity or energy in Port-au-Prince, in the city where he lives. Stores and schools were closed. Roads were closed. The hospitals were reportedly having dwindling supplies, no beds, no electricity. Food and basic household goods and just about everything else was in short supply. And of course, prices were skyrocketing amid both inflation and widespread gas rationing. So as Paul and I wrote back and forth to each other, I felt a curious sense of repetition. You know, so much about what was happening seemed new and urgent in some ways, and yet much of it seemed really familiar. It resonated with previous moments, previous years, previous crises. And when I asked Paul about that, he agreed, and he said that what it reminded him most of was the 1980s and 1990s, a time that he had lived through when he had been involved in the democratic movement against the dictatorship. He had lived through the fall of the Duvalier family dictatorship and the aftermath of it, that's sometimes called the democratic transition. Paul said that the reason it felt like a repetition was because the crisis brought about by the end of the dictatorship had never really gone away. And I've heard similar comments from friends in Port-au-Prince for many, many years. They often say that what the experts like to call the Haitian crisis is really something more like a permanent condition. And if that's the case, I always wonder, why call it crisis at all? Doesn't a crisis have a beginning and an end? It should be some sort of moment when something happens. And so perhaps the word is not enough to name what's happening in Haiti, but I do think that the underlying conceptual kernel behind the idea of crisis, which for me involves a sense of a stark situation that matters significantly to people, and that might even be a matter of life and death, I think that that conceptual core resonates with many residents in Port-au-Prince as a description of their lives. And yet, to understand what they talk about when they talk about crisis, it's important to see how they extend the term. They use a bunch of words for it in Creole, including crise, which is the Creole word for crisis. We have to understand how they extend those terms to describe not a singular event or a fleeting situation, as some might expect, but rather a pervasive condition, a context that has come to shape everyday life. And after decades of talking to people about this in Port-au-Prince, I've come to think of crisis as something like an atmosphere, the often invisible outer layer that surrounds us and envelopes us and comes to be taken for granted or perhaps even ignored. Well, we may not always notice the atmosphere, it's always there, and it sets the conditions of possibility, as it were, that give rise to what we do notice, the daily weather that shapes our everyday experience. And Paul told me that things were very bad in 2019 and that it was, in his words, the worst he had ever seen in Haiti. He said that the situation had become so extreme, it was invivable, unlivable. He used the French word, but it's also often said in Creole. The Creole word is invivable as well. And another friend in early 2019 told me in a phone conversation that his friends and family were suffering so much during the current political crisis that, in his words, "ne pas cap vivre," which in Creole could be translated into English in two different ways. We are not living, or we can't live. Over the past 2 years, I've heard others using similar language to describe the situation in Haiti. And so in my talk today, I want to take seriously this Haitian concept of invivab in order to ask what it might mean to say that one is not able to live, that one's not living, or that life has in some sense become unlivable. And to do so, I will reflect on what I'm going to call ordinary disaster and the atmosphere of crisis. By the first term, I mean an attempt to name the way that harmful or catastrophic situations get folded into everyday life as both common occurrences and experiences that go unremarked upon by governments or other institutions that are endowed with the power and the responsibility to declare crises and to intervene to resolve them or to manage them. The second term, the atmosphere of crisis, is an attempt to name the prevailing conditions that give rise to ordinary disasters, and at the same time that the conditions that make life feel unlivable. And by atmosphere, I mean something more than just the structural conditions that produce vulnerability or that precipitate crises. I mean those too, but I also mean something much more robust or broader in an anthropological sense, the social context of people's lives, everything that shapes and gives rise to not just disaster or tragedy, but also to political affects or feelings about crisis and life and everything in between. So let me flesh out a little bit more what I mean by ordinary disaster conceptually here. I'm drawing on a landmark essay written now 3 decades ago by the Haitian anthropologist Michel Rolfe-Triot, in which he challenged the dominant framework that always seems to cast Haiti as an oddity. And in noting that Haitian exceptionalism says more about the silences and structures of power at play in the relationship between Haiti and the West than it does about Haiti itself, Triot gave us a really powerful description of what he called the quite ordinary lives of Haitians. And I want to just read you a brief passage from Triot's essay. Triot writes, quote, "The majority of Haitians live quite ordinary lives. They eat what is for them and many others quite ordinary food. They die quite ordinary deaths from quite ordinary accidents, quite ordinary tortures, quite ordinary diseases. Accidents so ordinary that they could be prevented. Tortures so ordinary that the international press does not even mention them. Diseases so ordinary they're easily treated almost everywhere else." end quote. And you can see by that sense of repetition, he's really trying to do some work poetically with this idea of the quite ordinary. And I want to build on this idea then of the ordinary and on Trio's suggestion that accidents or tortures or diseases, the things that cause what he calls quite ordinary deaths, are not just common because they recur regularly, but are also in some sense rendered banal, in the sense that they go unremarked upon, unrecorded by the international press, ignored by the international community, or indeed silenced by the Haitian state. Their ordinariness makes them a part of everyday life, but in a telling turn of phrase, Trio also notes how their ordinariness lies in the fact that they could be prevented. And so for him, the ordinary is connected to what we might call the otherwise. Things could be otherwise. That this sense of ordinary yet preventable death turns the daily injuries and injustices experienced by so many Haitians into a social and a political fact rather than a natural or an ineluctable fact. Trio's formulation resonates with what I think has become the now dominant approach in disaster studies, according to which so-called natural disasters like floods, hurricanes, and earthquakes are understood to be the outcome of social processes that unfold over time and across space. And disasters cannot be reduced then, of course, we all know, to the natural hazards that cause them, because disasters always follow the fault lines of social inequality. Long ago, Mike Davis, writing about the disastrous urbanization of Southern California, gave a kind of added punch to this when he noted that disasters arise not just out of vulnerability, but out of what he called, quote, the explosive mixture of natural hazards and social contradictions. In a related sense, Charles Perrault famously characterized industrial disasters as what he called normal accidents, a phrase that he used to highlight how risks are built into complex systems and how the seemingly periodic accidents that often occur are in fact intrinsic to those systems rather than extrinsic to them. And I think that these three approaches, a focus on social vulnerability, the focus on the explosive effects of social contradictions, and the idea of normal accidents, can help us kind of get a sense of Trio's account of quite ordinary deaths and extend it to the experience of what I'm calling ordinary disaster. Disasters are ordinary in Haiti not only because they occur with great frequency, which is definitely true, but also because they could be otherwise. They could be prevented, and they are in fact regularly prevented elsewhere. Even something extraordinary like the 2010 earthquake, which destroyed much of Port-au-Prince, is catastrophic because of the many quite ordinary disasters that precipitated it and that followed in its wake. Ordinary disasters like weak national institutions or neoliberal economic policies, or ordinary disasters like debt dependency and decades of displacement, or even the kinds of structural violence that take shape in watered down concrete that makes houses shake and fall. So with all that in mind, I want to turn to an account, just one kind of small example of a quite ordinary disaster. And again, I'm drawing mostly on work done in 2019, last year in Haiti, and the global pandemic has changed a lot of this, but not all of it. So on March 31, 2019, a small twin-engine outboard boat carrying Haitian migrants capsized off the coast of the Turks and Caicos Islands, killing over a dozen people. That boat was making what Haitians call a Kante Voyage, a term that they use to refer to overseas migrant trips that are made either on sailboats or, more commonly, as was the case in this incident, small motorboats. Haitians have been making such voyages for decades, as migrants risk fortune and fate in an attempt to make it predominantly to the United States, but also to places like the Bahamas or other destinations where they hope to find work in seasonal agriculture or in construction or other industries. Kante Voyages peaked during the economic and political crises that defined the final years of the fall of the Duvalier dictatorship and the first decade or so of the democratic transition that was in the 1980s and early 1990s. It's a period when the American press constantly referred to Haitian migrants as so-called boat people. These journeys seem to be remarkably on the rise again, especially throughout much of 2019. In early 2019, in January, the United States Coast Guard interdicted a boat with 70 migrants on it, sending it back to Haiti. In February of that same year, another boat sank off the coast of the Bahamas, killing 28 people. And sensing a trend, the US Embassy in Haiti issued a public service announcement after the March 31 boat disaster, warning Haitians to, quote, no journey is worth risking lives. Please urge families and communities, this is again the US Embassy speaking, illegal migrant and smuggling operations are dangerous and frequently end in tragedy, end quote. So they They flag it as illegal in their announcement, of course. As is often the case, the warning put the blame on migrants themselves, but did little to dissuade people from making such voyages. And in the following months, there were, of course, predictably more boats, more disasters, and more deaths. The migrants who go overseas are quite aware of the risks, and they tend to explain their actions by saying that they must go in order to, and they draw on the Creole phrase here, chercher la vie, to look for life or to search for life. And as migrants frequently note, sometimes when you're looking for life, you find death. It's easy to hear when migrants make those kinds of comments, it's easy to hear a kind of fatalistic resignation. But I'd like to suggest that we try to understand those comments a little differently, to hear in them a kind of way of theorizing the necessity and at the same time the impossibility of chercher la vie, of looking for life, and to understand that feeling as a kind of structure of feeling that draws its rhetorical force from the starkness of life and death, but that also contains within it a pointed political commentary about a profoundly human experience. So talking about all the small disasters of everyday life can give people a way to talk about the possibility of their own death before it happens. We might even say it gives people the chance to talk about the impossibilities of chercher la vie, of looking for life, or of finding la vie, which that's the Creole word, can be translated into English as in several ways, as a living, a livelihood, or a life. And I think that there's a lot of resonance across those three in the Creole word. For in those small disasters of capsized boats, there's always, of course, a much larger story. And it's the story of a disaster that has unfolded over decades in Haiti, a story really of the end of a whole way of life or a whole world. Overseas migrants risk the seas for the same reasons that migrants come to Port-au-Prince and end up in the vast slums of the city in the neighborhoods where I've been working for a couple of decades. Migrants are fleeing ecological devastation in the countryside. They're pushed out by the collapse of a peasant economy that can't compete with a massive amount of foreign food that comes into the country through open trade borders and through foreign aid. They're trying to make money any way they can. Decades of neoliberal economic policies and structural adjustment programs have left them in a desperate situation, and they face the material fact that their lives have become unlivable. They feel the violence of a system that threatens their survival, and so the unlivable appears to them in the soaring prices of basic goods and the falling value of their time and labor, in the inflationary dynamics of a system that seems to promise only ever more disaster. And that, I think, is how crisis takes shape in the lives and the lived experience of many Haitians. It appears in such banal or ordinary disasters as a capsized boat. I think that ordinary disasters can be an occasion for talking about life and death, but they also raise questions of responsibility, especially the political responsibility of the state to its citizens. Reflecting on that March boat disaster, the Haitian journalist Frans Duval offered a pointed critique in his weekly column in which he insisted that the boat disaster be understood as a matter of national concern because, in his idea and his phrasing, the migrants were dead because the state had abdicated its responsibility to govern. And in making that argument, Duval was drawing on a key mode of political discourse in Haiti in which talk of the state oscillates between a demand that the state be responsible to the nation and a critique that the state is too weak or too fragile to effectively do so. Duvalier thus framed the boat disaster as the outcome of a series of actions and inactions on the part of the Haitian government. And in that sense, he put his critique in relation to a wider context that his readers should be thinking of, which at that time included all those things that Paul was mentioning in his conversations with me in early 2019. At the time of that boat disaster, there were widespread protests throughout Port-au-Prince, daily, weekly, monthly protests calling for the end of the government. Those protests were calling for the president to step down and all kinds of other changes that people were demanding. Those protests continued to grow in scale and scope throughout 2019, and they saw, again, repeated demands for the government to step down. The president and much of the government has been implicated in a corruption scandal that seems to suggest that political leaders have stolen somewhere between $2 and $4 billion from a development fund. And the protests were also, I think importantly, not really just about the particular government. Beyond the calls for the government to step down, protesters were very clear that they were also protesting other things, including the whole system of international aid and its failures around the reconstruction project after the 2010 earthquake. And they were calling, in particular, using some key Haitian terms here, for an end to misère, the Creole word for misery or deep poverty, or the end to insécurité, or insecurity. And especially the protesters were demanding a response to what they call la vie chère, or the high cost of living. Some of the protesters even accused the government and the ruling political party of arming gangs to terrorize their opponents, something that's got markedly worse in 2020. In short, the protesters drew a causal connection between the everyday experiences of ordinary disaster and the presence of the state in their daily lives, or really, as many refer to it, the absence of the state in their daily lives. But I think it's worth sort of pausing for a second and wondering whether the Haitian state really is absent from people's lives. It certainly seems that way, and I think that many international experts write a lot about state weakness, fragility, and state failure in Haiti. But in what follows, I'd like to instead suggest that the state might actually be quite present in people's lives, and in fact deeply implicated in what I would call ordinary disasters. So I want to jump back a little bit before the 2019 boat disaster and talk about something that precipitated a lot of that. In July of 2018, the Haitian government announced a plan to end state subsidies on imported fuel and energy products. Seemingly banal kind of policy, right? That plan was part of a national macroeconomic policy that was drafted by the International Monetary Fund that aimed to address the country's deep fiscal crisis. The IMF had been calling for an end to fuel subsidies all around the world as part of the organization's overall approach to balancing budgets and to reducing the role of governments in energy markets. In Haiti, the plan would have had very far-reaching effects, and it would have sent the prices of kerosene, diesel, and gasoline, the main sources of fuel for most people in their daily lives, skyrocketing. Public response was immediate as people took to the streets in protest. Within days, the government backed down, the IMF deferred the plan, although it's still on the books to eventually happen, and the prime minister resigned. Those initial protests were characterized in the media as something like food riots, and I think that we've seen in many, many cases around the world over the past 5 or 10 years or so that fuel protests are sort of like the new food riots in a way. But as E.P. Thompson noted long ago in the case of bread riots in England, these kinds of protests are never as obvious or immediate as they might seem. Indeed, such actions are usually deeply mediated by a shared set of feelings, attitudes, and dispositions, or what Thompson called a political culture. The political culture that leads people to protest in Haiti is rooted in a recognition of just how much global and national markets already impact their daily lives. There's a really intimate sense of sort of global prices of many kinds of products on the streets of Port-au-Prince. The Caribbean has some of the highest energy costs in the world, and Haiti has some of the highest among those, as well as the lowest rates of energy access in the region. Most of the population of Haiti outside of major cities has hardly any access to electrical power, which is predominantly generated by imported fuel oil. On top of that, any change in the cost of gasoline or other fuels would quickly scale up into escalating costs of other household goods, from cooking oil to food to just about everything else. So the proposed end of those fuel subsidies, which were part of a larger set of structural changes that have already curtailed the role of government in public life, was felt by many people to be a violation of the government's responsibility to intervene in and to help ameliorate the effects of what Haitians call la vie chère, or the high cost of living. The subsidies remain in place for now, but in a strange kind of irony, the crisis that the proposed change signaled came anyway. In the 2 years since those fuel protests, the entire country has been drawn into an ever-deepening crisis that has cascaded across all spheres of social life, moving from that macroeconomic policy and those conditionalities of the international community to the national budget, which has actually not been ratified in years, to the government itself, which has gone through several prime ministers and has now, in fact, drifted into one-man rule as President Moise is currently governing without a sitting parliament. Alongside all of this has been a corruption scandal and an energy crisis that is connected to the regional fallout from the end of the Venezuela-backed PetroCaribe program, which is a program designed to get oil to Caribbean neighbors for cheap prices as part of a development program. All of this has led in Haiti to frequent blackouts, fuel rationing, and the shuttering of gas stations. So while the subsidies remain in place, prices for fuel and other goods have skyrocketed anyway amid soaring inflation. Now, the government's inability to provide energy to its citizens which I think we can see kind of phenomenologically as a sort of a lack of a capacity to act, a lack of kind of power, has been met with stiff protest, notably with a series of anti-government demonstrations and a countrywide general strike that has shut down most aspects of everyday life for much of 2019. The people have backed off, the organizers have backed off the protests in 2020, but the country remains locked down for other reasons, as many of us are of course locked down or shut down now because of the global pandemic. But for large parts of 2019 in Haiti, schools were closed and the students lost a whole year's worth of schools because the terms were closed. Market stalls were empty, hospitals had no supplies. And so in that context, the blackout was a kind of potent image for the state's failure in a much more sort of general sense, its inability to provide the conditions that would make life go. And then the general strike and the roadblock became the kind of counter image, an alternative kind of mode of shutting down the country, an emblem of the total dissatisfaction that people have with the status quo. And that political feeling of dissatisfaction, I think, is about more than the failures of any particular government. It's about a sense that the state itself is the problem, in a sense that the state and the broader international system to which it's bound is unable to resolve the situation precisely because the state is deeply implicated in the various conditions that give rise to crisis. And this is the context in which I think everyday, banal, ordinary disasters like migrants dying, trying to make it overseas, take place. Those seemingly normal accidents or ordinary disasters arise out of the deep entanglement of Haitian government offices, foreign multinational companies, international financial institutions, and the UN's military and humanitarian agencies. They emerge out of the tight coupling of national budgets and foreign debt and monetary policies, currency fluctuations, and inflation. Ordinary disasters are the normal accidents of stolen development funds and unbuilt projects, washed out roads and blackouts and gas rationings, or cholera in the water supply. Such disasters are the banal stuff of life in Haiti today, where you see closed schools, undersupplied hospitals, barricaded roads, high prices and low wages, or armed gangs and capsized boats. And these are, I think, kind of all ordinary disasters of the state kind. They're sudden but anticipated features of a political and economic system that generates crisis again and again, and then normalizes it by reducing it in various ways, silencing it, denying it, modeling it, categorizing it as risk or underdevelopment or informality, or any of the other terms of trivialization that get used to hide the political damage and destruction of the neoliberal state. And in the process, the social distribution of crisis and disaster just becomes another state effect. And I think what gets hidden then is sort of the weight of the state, how the state serves as the political gravity that kind of holds the atmosphere of crisis in place. I want to return now to that category of the invivable or unlivable life. A few months after my initial chat with my friend Paul, in which he told me that life had become unlivable, he wrote to tell me about escalating gang violence in Marizan, the neighborhood of Port-au-Prince where he lives and in which I have conducted ethnographic research for many years. He told me that the situation was worse now than under the dictatorship, in part because the gangs were not beholden to any particular political party or ideology. And so for that reason, the gang violence just seemed to be sort of unbounded and free-floating. It was so full of uncertainty, you never knew who anyone was or what side they were on. And so I'm interested in Paul's and many other people's ideas to draw together the sense of unlivable life with this qualifier that now is somehow the worst time in Haiti. I'm not interested in verifying that kind of statement, and I don't know what criteria we could use to do it, but I'm interested instead on that kind of atmospheric conditions of permanent crisis and ordinary disasters that combine to produce this as a certain kind of political feeling or a political mood or a political affect. And I think that if we pay attention to this kind of discourse, and I'm really interested in the categories that Haitians themselves use to theorize their own experience, if we pay attention to this sort of discourse, which is really emergent, I haven't really come across this idea of the unlivable in earlier research in Haiti. It seems like a new language that people are trying to use to describe a new version of this sort of permanent crisis. And so I think that if we pay attention to it and try to hear what people are saying with it, we can see that crisis feels deeply embodied, very intimate, like a loss of power. It can feel like a blackout. It can feel like the need to chercher la vie, to look for life, and then to only find death. And it can feel like the end of a world or the end of a future, the end of possibilities. And that feeling, that experience of crisis, I think, is essential to understanding the state of crisis as a lived condition and the crisis of the state as a political problem. It's this experience that people draw on when they say now, as they do, like Paul says, that this is the worst it has ever been. Worse than the blackouts before, worse than looking for life and sometimes dying, worse than the earthquake, in fact. So to think of 2019 or 2020 or the present moment of crisis as the worst is really to try to name a kind of deeply felt experience of all those previous disasters folding into the current one and giving weight and shape and context to a sentiment that life has now in some way become unlivable. And so if life has become unlivable, then what? Or perhaps it's better to ask, after life, what comes next? For some, what comes next is that risky journey of migrants going overseas on a Kante voyage. For others, it means the endless attempt to chercher la vie in whatever way they can, to look for life in the slums of Port-au-Prince or elsewhere. There are other responses too, but so many of them are too easily rendered, at least from a kind of outsider perspective, as individual matters, as the banal stuff of private lives, private decisions, and worse, private failures. But to really understand what it means to live an unlivable life, I think we have to understand what people have begun to feel, that life has become unlivable in Haiti just at the same time that they also begin to feel that the state has ceased to govern. This would seem to suggest that the state enters people's lives in a disastrous way, that the concentration of politics around life itself, which has been so central to the sort of the rise of the modern nation state, that sort of biopolitical paradigm of the nation state, seems to be in Haiti taking on a new and catastrophic mode that is geared not towards making people live or letting them die, but rather towards producing a kind of monstrous hybrid, this unlivable as a condition or form of life. And it's in this context, I think, that people in Haiti have been protesting for well over a couple of years now, protesting not just a particular government, but a whole political context that directly and indirectly threatens them. And it's this context that I think, if we pay attention to this context, we can begin to understand this category of invivable, where the unlivable becomes a way to name a whole experience of uncertainty and impossibility. To say that life is unlivable or that we cannot live, to say that one is already dead, or to say any of that is to give voice to a political experience. It's to express a structure of feeling that's both a profound commentary on how crisis feels and a powerful theory of what it means to live in the wake of life, to experience catastrophe as it unfolds slowly around us, giving shape to everyday life and to what Trio called those quite ordinary deaths. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg.